Chapter 41. What befell Mr. Pickwick when he got into the Fleet, what debtors he saw there, and how he passed the night. Mr. Tom Roker, the gentleman who had accompanied Mr. Pickwick into the prison, turned sharp round to the right when he got to the bottom of the little flight of steps, and led the way through an iron gate which stood open, and up another short flight of steps, into a long, narrow gallery, dirty and low, paved with stone, and very dimly lighted by a window at each remote end. "This," said the gentleman, thrusting his hands into his pockets, and looking carelessly over his shoulder to Mr. Pickwick, "this here is the hall flight." "Oh," replied Mr. Pickwick, looking down a dark and filthy staircase, which appeared to lead to a range of damp and gloomy stone vaults beneath the ground. "And those, I suppose, are the little cellars where the prisoners keep their small quantities of coals. Ah, unpleasant places to have to go down to, but very convenient, I dare say." "Yes, I shouldn't wonder if they was convenient," replied the gentleman, "seeing that a few people live there pretty snug. That's the fare, that is." "My friend," said Mr. Pickwick, "you don't really mean to say that human beings live down in those wretched dungeons?" "Don't I?" replied Mr. Roker, with indignant astonishment. "Why shouldn't I?" "Live? Live down there?" exclaimed Mr. Pickwick. "Live down there, yes, and die down there, too, very often," replied Mr. Roker. "And what of that? Who's got to say anything agin it? Live down there, yes, and a very good place it is to live in, ain't it?" As Mr. Roker turned somewhat fiercely upon Mr. Pickwick in saying this, and moreover muttered, in an excited fashion, certain unpleasant invocations concerning his own eyes, limbs, and circulating fluids, the latter gentleman deemed it advisable to pursue the discourse no further. Mr. Roker then proceeded to mount another staircase, as dirty as that which led to the place which had just been the subject of discussion, in which ascent he was closely followed by Mr. Pickwick and Sam. "There," said Mr. Roker, pausing for breath when they reached another gallery of the same dimensions as the one below. "This is the coffee-room flight. The one above's the third, and the one above that's the top. And the room where you're going to sleep tonight is the warden's room, and it's this way. Come on." Having said all this in a breath, Mr. Roker mounted another flight of stairs, with Mr. Pickwick and Sam Weller following at his heels. These staircases received light from sundry windows placed at some little distance above the floor, and looking into a gravelled area bounded by a high brick wall, with iron chevaux de frise at the top, this area, it appeared from Mr. Roker's statement, was the racket ground, and it further appeared, on the testimony of the same gentleman, that there was a smaller area in that portion of the prison which was nearest Farringdon Street, denominated and called the Painted Ground, from the fact of its walls having once displayed the semblance of various men of war in full sail, and other artistical effects, achieved in bygone times by some imprisoned draftsman in his leisure hours. Having communicated this piece of information, apparently more for the purpose of discharging his bosom of an important fact than with any specific view of enlightening Mr. Pickwick, the guide, having at length reached another gallery, led the way into a small passage at the extreme end, opened a door, and disclosed an apartment of an appearance by no means inviting, containing 8 or 9 iron bedsteads. "There," said Mr. Roker, holding the door open and looking triumphantly round at Mr. Pickwick. "There's the room." Mr. Pickwick's face, however, betokened such a very trifling portion of satisfaction at the appearance of his lodging, that Mr. Roker looked for a reciprocity of feeling into the countenance of Samuel Weller, who, until now, had observed a dignified silence. "There's a room, young man," observed Mr. Roker. "I say it," replied Sam, with a placid nod of the head. "You wouldn't think to find such a room as this in the Farringdon Hotel, would you?" said Roker, with a complacent smile. To this Mr. Weller replied with an easy and unstudied closing of one eye, which might be considered to mean either that he would have thought it, or that he would not have thought it, or that he had never thought anything at all about it, just as the observer's imagination suggested. Having executed this feat, and reopened his eye, Mr. Weller proceeded to inquire which was the individual bedstead that Mr. Roker had so flatteringly described as an out-and-outer to sleep in. "That's it," replied Mr. Roker, pointing to a very rusty one in a corner. "It would make anyone go to sleep, that bedstead would, whether they wanted to or not." "I should think," said Sam, eyeing the piece of furniture in question with a look of excessive disgust, "I should think poppies was nothing to it." "Nothing at all," said Mr. Roker. "And I suppose," said Sam, with a sidelong glance at his master, as if to see whether there were any symptoms of his determination being shaken by what passed, "I suppose the other gentlemen as sleeps here are gentlemen?" "Nothing but it," said Mr. Roker. "One of them takes his 12 pints of ale a day, and never leaves off smoking, even at his meals." "He must be a first-rater," said Sam. "Aye, aye," replied Mr. Roker. Nothing daunted, even by this intelligence, Mr. Pickwick smilingly announced his determination to test the powers of the narcotic bedstead for that night, and Mr. Roker, after informing him that he could retire to rest at whatever hour he thought proper, without any further notice or formality, walked off, leaving him standing with Sam in the gallery. It was getting dark. That is to say, a few gas jets were kindled in this place, which was never light, by way of compliment to the evening, which had set in outside. As it was rather warm, some of the tenants of the numerous little rooms which opened into the gallery on either hand had set their doors ajar. Mr. Pickwick peeped into them as he passed along, with great curiosity and interest. Here, 4 or 5 great hulking fellows, just visible through a cloud of tobacco smoke, were engaged in noisy and riotous conversation over half-emptied pots of beer, or playing at all fours with a very greasy pack of cards. In the adjoining room, some solitary tenant might be seen poring by the light of a feeble tallow candle over a bundle of soiled and tattered papers, yellow with dust and dropping to pieces from age, writing, for the 100th time, some lengthened statement of his grievances, for the perusal of some great man whose eyes it would never reach, or whose heart it would never touch. In a third, a man, with his wife and a whole crowd of children, might be seen making up a scanty bed on the ground, or upon a few chairs, or for the younger ones to pass the night in. And in a fourth, and a fifth, and a sixth, and a seventh, the noise, and the beer, and the tobacco smoke, and all the cards, all came over again in greater force than before. In the galleries themselves, and more especially on the staircases, there lingered a great number of people who came there, some because their rooms were empty and lonesome, others because their rooms were full and hot, and the greater part because they were restless and uncomfortable, and not possessed of the secret of exactly knowing what to do with themselves. There were many classes of people here, from the laboring man in his fustian jacket to the broken-down spendthrift in his shawl dressing-gown, most appropriately out at elbows. But there was the same air about them all, a kind of listless, jailbird careless swagger, a vagabondish who's-afraid sort of bearing, which is wholly indescribable in words, but which any man can understand in one moment if he wishes, by just setting foot in the nearest debtor's prison, and looking at the very first group of people he sees there with the same interest as Mr. Pickwick did. "It strikes me, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, leaning over the iron rail at the stairhead, "it strikes me, Sam, that imprisonment for debt is scarcely any punishment at all." "Think not, sir?" inquired Mr. Weller. "You see how these fellows drink and smoke and roar," replied Mr. Pickwick. "It's quite impossible that they can mind it much." "Ah, that's the ruddy thing, sir," rejoined Sam. "They don't mind it. It's a regular holiday to them, all porter and skittles. It's the t'other ones as get done over with this sort of thing. Them down-hearted fellows as can't fig away at the beer, nor play skittles neither. Them as would pay if they could, and get slow by being boxed up. I tell you what it is, sir. Them as is always idling in public houses, it don't damage at all. And them as is always a-working when they can, it damages too much. It's unequal, as my father used to say, when his grog warn't made half and half. It's unequal, and that's the fault on it." "I think you're right, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, after a few moments' reflection. "Quite right." "Perhaps now and then there's some honest people as likes it," observed Mr. Weller, in a ruminative tone. "But I never heard of one I can call to mind, except the dirty-faced man in the brown coat, and that was force of habit." "And who was he?" inquired Mr. Pickwick. "Why, that's just the ruddy point, as nobody never knowed," replied Sam. But what did he do? Why, he did what many men as has been much better knowed has done in their time, sir, replied Sam. He run a match again the constable and won it. In other words, I suppose, said Mr. Pickwick, he got into debt. Just that, sir, replied Sam. And in course of time, he come here in consequence. It warn't much, execution for £9 nothing, multiplied by 5 for costs, but howsoever here, he stopped for 17 year. If he got any wrinkles in his face, they was stopped up with the dirt, for both the dirty face and the brown coat was just the same as at the end of the time as they was at the beginning. He was a really peaceful, inoffending little creature, and was always a-bustling about for somebody, or playing rackets and never vinning, till at last the turnkeys they got quite fond on him, and he was in the lodge every night, a-chatting with them, and telling stories, and all that here. One night he was in there as usual, alone with a really old friend of his, as was on the lock, when he says all of a sudden, I ain't seen the market outside, Bill, he says. Fleet Market was there at the time. I ain't seen the market outside, Bill, he says, for 17 year. I know you ain't, says the turnkey, smoking his pipe. I should like to see it for a minute, Bill, he says. Really probable, says the turnkey, smoking his pipe really fierce, and making believe he warn't up to what the little man wanted. Bill, says the little man, more abrupt than a fool, I've got the fancy in my head. Let me see the public street once more before I die. And if I ain't struck with the apoplexy, I'll be back in 5 minutes by the clock. And what'd become of me if you was struck with apoplexy, says the turnkey. Why, says the little creature, whoever found me, 'ud bring me home, for I've got my card in my pocket. Bill, he says, number 20 coffee room, flight. And that was true, sure enough. For when he wanted to make the acquaintance of any newcomer, he used to pull out a little limp card with them words on it and nothing else. In consideration of which, he was always called number 20. The turnkey takes a fixed look at him, and at last he says in a solemn manner, 20, he says, I'll trust you. You won't get your old friend into trouble? No, no, my boy. I hope I've something better behind here, says the little man. And as he said it, he hit his little waistcoat very hard, and then a tear started out of each eye, which was really extraordinary, for it was supposed as water never touched his face. He shook the turnkey by the hand, out he went. And never came back again, said Mr. Pickwick. Wrong for once, sir, replied Mr. Weller. For back he come 2 minutes afore the time, a-biling with rage, saying how he'd been nearly run over by a hackney coach, that he warn't used to it, and he was blowed if he wouldn't write to Lord Mayor. They got him pacified at last, and for 5 year arter that, he never even so much as peeped out of the lodge gate. At the expiration of that time he died, I suppose, said Mr. Pickwick. No, he didn't, sir, replied Sam. He got a curiosity to go and taste the beer at a new public-house over the way, on the premises, and it was such a really nice parlour that he took it into his head to go there every night, which he did for a long time, always coming back regular about a quarter of an hour afore the gate shut, which was already snug and comfortable. At last he began to get so precious jolly that he used to forget how the time went, or care nothing at all about it, and he went on getting later and later, till one night his old friend was just a-shutting the gate, had turned the key in fact, when he come up. Hold, Bill, he says. What, you ain't come home yet, 20? Says the turnkey. I thought you was in long ago. No, I wasn't, says the little man with a smile. Well then, I tell you what it is, my friend, says the turnkey, opening the gate really slow and sulky. It's my opinion as you've got into bad company of late, which I'm really sorry to see. Now I don't wish to do anything harsh, he says, but if you can't confine yourself to steady circles, and find your way back at regular hours, as sure as you are standing there, I'll shut you out altogether. The little man was seized with a violent fit of trembling, and never went outside the prison walls afterwards. As Sam concluded, Mr. Pickwick slowly retraced his steps downstairs. After a few thoughtful turns in the painted ground, which, as it was now dark, was nearly deserted, he intimated to Mr. Weller that he thought it high time for him to withdraw for the night, requesting him to seek a bed in some adjacent public-house, and returning early in the morning to make arrangements for the removal of his master's wardrobe from the George and Vulture. This request Mr. Samuel Weller prepared to obey, with as good a grace as he could assume, but with a very considerable show of reluctance nevertheless. He even went so far as to essay sundry ineffectual hints regarding the expediency of stretching himself on the gravel for that night. But finding Mr. Pickwick obstinately deaf to any such suggestions, finally withdrew. There is no disguising the fact that Mr. Pickwick felt very low-spirited and uncomfortable, not for lack of society, for the prison was very full, and a bottle of wine would at once have purchased the utmost good fellowship of a few choice spirits, without any more formal ceremony of introduction. But he was alone in the coarse, vulgar crowd, and felt the depression of spirits and sinking of heart naturally consequent upon the reflection that he was cooped and caged up without a prospect of liberation. As to the idea of releasing himself by ministering to the sharpness of Dodson and Fogg, it never for an instant entered his thoughts. In this frame of mind he turned again into the coffee-room gallery and walked slowly to and fro. The place was intolerably dirty, and the smell of tobacco smoke perfectly suffocating. There was a perpetual slamming and banging of doors as the people went in and out, and the noise of their voices and footsteps echoed and re-echoed through the passage constantly. A young woman with a child in her arms, who seemed scarcely able to crawl from emaciation and misery, was walking up and down the passage in conversation with her husband, who had no other place to see her in. As they passed Mr. Pickwick, he could hear the female sob bitterly, and once she burst into such a passion of grief that she was compelled to lean against the wall for support, while the man took the child in his arms and tried to soothe her. Mr. Pickwick's heart was really too full to bear it, and he went upstairs to bed. Now, although the warden's room was a very uncomfortable one, being, in every point of decoration and convenience, several hundred degrees inferior to the commonest infirmary of a county jail, it had at present the merit of being wholly deserted, save by Mr. Pickwick himself. So he sat down at the foot of his little iron bedstead, and began to wonder how much a year the warden made out of the dirty room. Having satisfied himself, by mathematical calculation, that the apartment was about equal in annual value to the freehold of a small street in the suburbs of London, he took to wondering what possible temptation could have induced a dingy-looking fly that was crawling over his pantaloons to come into a close prison when he had the choice of so many airy situations. A course of meditation which led him to the irresistible conclusion that the insect was insane. After settling this point, he began to be conscious that he was getting sleepy, whereupon he took his nightcap out of his pocket, in which he had had the precaution to stow it in the morning, and, leisurely undressing himself, got into bed and fell asleep. "Bravo! Heel over toe! Cut and shuffle! Pay away at it, Zephyr! I'm smothered if the upper house isn't your proper hemisphere! Keep it up! Hooray!" These expressions, delivered in a most boisterous tone, and accompanied with loud peals of laughter, roused Mr. Pickwick from one of those sound slumbers which, lasting in reality some half-hour, seems to the sleeper to have been protracted for about 3 weeks or a month. The voice had no sooner ceased than the room was shaken with such violence that the windows rattled in their frames, and the bedsteads trembled again. Mr. Pickwick started up, and remained for some minutes fixed in mute astonishment at the scene before him. On the floor of the room, a man in a broad-skirted green coat, with corduroy knee-smalls and a grey cotton stockings, was performing the most popular steps of a hornpipe, with a slang and burlesque caricature of grace and lightness which, combined with the very appropriate character of his costume, was inexpressibly absurd. Another man, evidently very drunk, who had probably been tumbled into bed by his companions, was sitting up between the sheets, warbling as much as he could recollect of a comic song, with the most intensely sentimental feeling and expression, while a third, seated on one of the bedsteads, was applauding both performers with the air of a profound connoisseur, and encouraging them by such ebullitions of feeling as had already roused Mr. Pickwick from his sleep. This last man was an admirable specimen of a class of gentry which never can be seen in full perfection but in such places. They may be met with, in an imperfect state, occasionally about stable-yards and public houses, but they never attain their full bloom except in these hotbeds, which would almost seem to be considerably provided by the legislature for the sole purpose of rearing them. He was a tall fellow, with an olive complexion, long dark hair, and very thick bushy whiskers meeting under his chin. He wore no neckerchief, as he had been playing rackets all day, and his open shirt collar displayed their full luxuriance. On his head he wore one of the common 18-penny French skull-caps, with a gaudy tassel dangling therefrom, very happily in keeping with a common fustian coat. His legs, which, being long, were afflicted with weakness, graced a pair of Oxford mixture trousers, made to show the full symmetry of the limbs. Being somewhat negligently braced, however, and moreover, but imperfectly buttoned, they fell in a series of not the most graceful folds over a pair of shoes sufficiently down at heel to display a pair of very soiled white stockings. There was a rakish, vagabond smartness, and a kind of boastful rascality about the whole man that was worth a mine of gold. This figure was the first to perceive that Mr. Pickwick was looking on, upon which he winked to the Zephyr, and entreated him, with mock gravity, not to wake the gentleman. "Why, bless the gentleman's honest heart and soul," said the Zephyr, turning round and affecting the extremity of surprise. "The gentleman is awake. Shakespeare. How do you do, sir? How is Mary and Sarah, sir? And the dear old lady at home, sir? Eh, sir? Will you have the kindness to put my compliments into the first little parcel you're sending that way, sir? And say that I would have sent them before, only I was afraid they might be broken in the wagon, sir?" "Don't overwhelm the gentleman with ordinary civilities when you see he's anxious to have something to drink," said the gentleman with the whiskers, with a jocose air. "Why don't you ask the gentleman what he'll take?" "Dear me, I quite forgot," replied the other. "What will you take, sir? Will you take port wine, sir, or sherry wine, sir? I can recommend the ale, sir. Or perhaps you'd like to take the porter, sir. Allow me to have the felicity of hanging up your nightcap, sir." With this, the speaker snatched that article of dress from Mr. Pickwick's head, and fixed it in a twinkling on that of the drunken man, who, firmly impressed with the belief that he was delighting a numerous assembly, continued to hammer away at the comic song in the most melancholy strains imaginable. Taking a man's nightcap from his brow by violent means, and adjusting it on the head of an unknown gentleman of dirty exterior, however ingenious a witticism in itself, is unquestionably one of those which come under the denomination of practical jokes. Viewing the matter precisely in this light, Mr. Pickwick, without the slightest intimation of his purpose, sprang vigorously out of bed, struck the Zephyr so smart a blow in the chest as to deprive him of a considerable portion of the commodity which sometimes bears his name, and then, recapturing his nightcap, boldly placed himself in an attitude of defense. "Now," said Mr. Pickwick, gasping no less from excitement than from the expenditure of so much energy, "come on, both of you! And with this liberal invitation, the worthy gentleman communicated a revolving motion to his clenched fists, by way of appalling his antagonists with a display of science. It might have been Mr. Pickwick's very unexpected gallantry, or it might have been the complicated manner in which he had got himself out of bed and fallen all in a mass upon the hornpipe man, that touched his adversaries. Touched they were, for, instead of then and there making an attempt to commit manslaughter, as Mr. Pickwick implicitly believed they would have done, they paused, stared at each other a short time, and finally laughed outright. "Well, you're a trump, and I like you all the better for it," said the Zephyr. "Now jump into bed again, or you'll catch the rheumatics. No malice, I hope?" said the man, extending a hand about the size of the yellow clump of fingers which sometimes swings over a glover's door. "Certainly not," said Mr. Pickwick, with great alacrity. For now that the excitement was over, he began to feel rather cool about the legs. "Allow me the honour, sir," said the gentleman with the whiskers, presenting his dexter hand, and aspirating the H. "With much pleasure, sir," said Mr. Pickwick, and having executed a very long and solemn shake, he got into bed again. "My name is Smangle, sir," said the man with the whiskers. "Oh," said Mr. Pickwick. "Mine is Mivens," said the man in the stockings. "I'm delighted to hear it, sir," said Mr. Pickwick. "Ahem," coughed Mr. Smangle. "Did you speak, sir?" said Mr. Pickwick. "No, I did not, sir," said Mr. Smangle. "I thought you did, sir," said Mr. Pickwick. All this was very genteel and pleasant, and, to make matters still more comfortable, Mr. Smangle assured Mr. Pickwick a great many times that he entertained a very high respect for the feelings of a gentleman, which sentiment, indeed, did him infinite credit, as he could be in no wise supposed to understand them. "Are you going through the court, sir?" inquired Mr. Smangle. "Through the what?" said Mr. Pickwick. "Through the court. Portugal Street, the court for the relief of... you know." Oh, no," replied Mr. Pickwick. "No, I am not." "Going out, perhaps?" suggested Mivens. "I fear not," replied Mr. Pickwick. "I refuse to pay some damages, and am here in consequence." "Ah," said Mr. Smangle. "Paper has been my ruin." "A stationer, I presume, sir?" said Mr. Pickwick innocently. "Stationer! No, confound and curse me. Not so low as that. No trade. When I say paper, I mean bills." "Oh, you use the word in that sense, I see," said Mr. Pickwick. "Damn me! A gentleman must expect reverses," said Smangle. "What of that? Here am I in the Fleet Prison. Well, good. What then? I'm none the worse for that, am I?" "Not a bit," replied Mr. Mivins, and he was quite right, for, so far from Mr. Smangle being any the worse for it, he was something the better, inasmuch as to qualify himself for the place, he had attained gratuitous possession of certain articles of jewelry, which, long before that, had found their way to the pawnbrokers. "Well, but come," said Mr. Smangle, "this is dry work. Let's rinse our mouths with a drop of burnt sherry. The last comer shall stand it, Mivins shall fetch it, and I'll help to drink it. That's a fair and gentlemanlike division of labour, anyhow. Curse me!" Unwilling to hazard another quarrel, Mr. Pickwick gladly assented to the proposition, and consigned the money to Mr. Mivins, who, as it was nearly 11 o'clock, lost no time in repairing to the coffee-room on his errand. "I say," whispered Smangle, the moment his friend had left the room, "what did you give him?" "Half a sovereign," said Mr. Pickwick. "He's a devilish pleasant, gentlemanly dog," said Mr. Smangle. "Infernal pleasant. I don't know anybody more so. But, Here Mr. Smangle stopped short and shook his head dubiously. "You don't think there is any probability of his appropriating the money to his own use?" said Mr. Pickwick. Oh, no. Mind, I don't say that. I expressly say he's a devilish gentlemanly fellow," said Mr. Smangle. "But I think, perhaps, if somebody went down just to see that he didn't drop his beak into the jug by accident, or make some confounded mistake in losing the money as he came upstairs, it would be as well. Here, you, sir, just run downstairs and look after that gentleman, will you?" This request was addressed to a little, timid-looking, nervous man, whose appearance bespoke great poverty, and who had been crouching on his bedstead all this while, apparently quite stupefied by the novelty of his situation. "You know where the coffee-room is," said Smangle. "Just run down and tell that gentleman you've come to help him up with the jug. Oh, stop, I'll tell you what. I'll tell you how we'll do him," said Smangle, with a cunning look. "How?" said Mr. Pickwick. "Send down word that he's to spend the change in cigars. Capital thought. Run and tell him that, d'ye hear? They shan't be wasted," continued Smangle, turning to Mr. Pickwick. "I'll smoke 'em." This manoeuvring was so exceedingly ingenious, and, withal, performed with such immovable composure and coolness, that Mr. Pickwick would have had no wish to disturb it, even if he had had the power. In a short time Mr. Mivins returned, bearing the sherry, which Mr. Smangle dispensed in 2 little cracked mugs, considerately remarking, with reference to himself, that a gentleman must not be particular under such circumstances, and, for his part, he was not too proud to drink out of the jug, in which, to show his sincerity, he forthwith pledged the company in a draught which half emptied it. An excellent understanding having been, by these means, promoted, Mr. Smangle proceeded to entertain his hearers with a relation of diverse romantic adventures in which he had been from time to time engaged, involving various interesting anecdotes of a thoroughbred horse and a magnificent Jewess, both of surpassing beauty and much coveted by the nobility and gentry of these kingdoms. Long before these elegant extracts from the biography of a gentleman were concluded, Mr. Mivins had betaken himself to bed and set in snoring for the night, leaving the timid stranger and Mr. Pickwick to the full benefit of Mr. Smangle's experiences. Nor were the 2 last-named gentlemen as much edified as they might have been by the moving passages which were narrated. Mr. Pickwick had been in a state of slumber for some time, when he had a faint perception of the drunken man bursting out afresh with the comic song, and receiving from Mr. Smangle a gentle intimation, through the medium of the water-jug, that his audience were not musically disposed. He then once again dropped off to sleep, with a confused consciousness that Mr. Smangle was still engaged in relating a long story, the chief point of which appeared to be that, on some occasion particularly stated and set forth, he had done a bill and a gentleman at the same time. Chapter 42. Illustrative, like the preceding one, of the old proverb that adversity brings a man acquainted with strange bedfellows, likewise containing Mr. Pickwick's extraordinary and startling announcement to Mr. Samuel Weller. When Pickwick opened his eyes next morning, the first object upon which they rested was Samuel Weller, seated upon a small black portmanteau, intently regarding, apparently in a condition of profound abstraction, the stately figure of the dashing Mr. Smangle, while Mr. Smangle himself, who was already partially dressed, was seated on his bedstead, occupied in the desperately hopeless attempt of staring Mr. Weller out of countenance. We say desperately hopeless, because Sam, with a comprehensive gaze which took in Mr. Smangle's cap, feet, head, face, legs, and whiskers, all at the same time, continued to look steadily on with every demonstration of lively satisfaction, but with no more regard to Mr. Smangle's personal sentiments on the subject than he would have displayed had he been inspecting a wooden statue or a straw-emboweled Guy Fawkes. "Well, will you know me again?" said Mr. Smangle with a frown. "It's fair to you anywhere, sir," replied Sam cheerfully. "Don't be impertinent to a gentleman, sir," said Mr. Smangle. "Not on no account," replied Sam. "If you'll tell me when he wakes, I'll be upon the very best extra super behaviour." This observation, having a remote tendency to imply that Mr. Smangle was no gentleman, rather kindled his ire. "Mivins," said Mr. Smangle, with a passionate air. "What's the office?" replied that gentleman from his couch. "Who the devil is this fellow?" "Gad," said Mivins, looking lazily out from under the bedclothes. "I ought to ask you that. Hasn't he any business here?" "No," replied Smangle. "Then knock him downstairs, and tell him not to presume to get up till I come and kick him," rejoined Mr. Mivins. And with this prompt advice, that excellent gentleman again betook himself to slumber. The conversation exhibiting these unequivocal symptoms of rather verging on the personal, Mr. Pickwick deemed it a fit point at which to interpose. "Sam," said Mr. Pickwick. "Sir?" rejoined that gentleman. "Has anything new occurred since last night?" "Nothing particular, sir," replied Sam, glancing at Mr. Smangle's whiskers. "The late prevalence of a close and confined atmosphere has been rather favourable to the growth of age, of an alarming and sanguinary nature. But with that exception, things is quite enough." "I shall get up," said Mr. Pickwick. "Give me some clean things." Whatever hostile intentions Mr. Smangle might have entertained, his thoughts were speedily diverted by the unpacking of the portmanteau, the contents of which appeared to impress him at once with a most favourable opinion, not only of Mr. Pickwick, but of Sam also, who, he took an early opportunity of declaring, in a tone of voice loud enough for that eccentric personage to overhear, was a regular thoroughbred original, and consequently the very man after his own heart. As to Mr. Pickwick, the affection he conceived for him knew no limits. "Now, is there anything I can do for you, my dear sir?" said Smangle. "Nothing that I am aware of. I am obliged to you," replied Mr. Pickwick. "No linen that you want sent to the washerwoman's? I know a delightful washerwoman outside that comes for my things twice a week, and by Jove, how devilish lucky! This is the very day she calls. Shall I put away any of those little things up with mine? Don't say anything about the trouble. Confound and curse it! If one gentleman under a cloud is not to put himself a little out of the way to assist another gentleman in the same condition, what's human nature?" Thus spake Mr. Smangle, edging himself meanwhile as near as possible to the portmanteau, and beaming forth looks of the most fervent and disinterested friendship. "There's nothing you want to give out for the man to brush, my dear creature, is there?" resumed Smangle. "Nothing whatever, my fine feller," rejoined Sam, taking the reply into his own mouth. "Perhaps if one of us was to brush, without troubling the man, it'd be more agreeable for all parties, as the schoolmaster said, when the young gentleman objected to being flogged by the butler." "And there's nothing that I can send in my little box to the washerwoman's, is there?" said Smangle, turning from Sam to Mr. Pickwick, with an air of some discomfiture. "Nothing whatever, sir," retorted Sam. "I'm afeard the little box must be chock full of your own as it is." This speech was accompanied with such a very expressive look at that particular portion of Mr. Smangle's attire, by the appearance of which the skill of laundresses in getting up gentlemen's linen is generally tested, that he was fain to turn upon his heel, and, for the present at any rate, to give up all design on Mr. Pickwick's purse and wardrobe. He accordingly retired in dudgeon to the racket ground, where he made a light and wholesome breakfast upon a couple of cigars, which had been purchased on the previous night. Mr. Mivins, who was no smoker, and whose account for small articles of chandlery had also reached down to the bottom of the slate, had been carried over to the other side, remained in bed, and, in his own words, took it out and sleep. After breakfasting in a small closet attached to the coffee room, which bore the imposing title of the snuggery, the temporary inmate of which, in consideration of a small additional charge, has the unspeakable advantage of overhearing all the conversation in the coffee room aforesaid, and after dispatching Mr. Weller on some necessary errands, Mr. Pickwick repaired to the lodge to consult Mr. Roker concerning his future accommodation. "Accommodation, eh?" said that gentleman, consulting a large book. "Plenty of that, Mr. Pickwick. Your chummage ticket will be on 27 in the 3rd. "Oh," said Mr. Pickwick. What did you say?" "Your chummage ticket," replied Mr. Roker. "You're up to that?" "Not quite," replied Mr. Pickwick, with a smile. "Why," said Mr. Roker, "it's as plain as Salisbury. You'll have a chummage ticket upon 27 in the 3rd, and them as is in the room will be your chums." "Are there many of them?" inquired Mr. Pickwick, dubiously. "3," replied Mr. Roker. Mr. Pickwick coughed. "One of them's a parson," said Mr. Roker, filling up a little piece of paper as he spoke. "Another's a butcher." "Eh?" exclaimed Mr. Pickwick. "A butcher," repeated Mr. Roker, giving the nib of his pen a tap on the desk to cure it of a disinclination to mark. "What a thorough-paced goer he used to be, surely. You remember Tom Martin, Neddy?" said Roker, appealing to another man in the lodge, who was paring the mud off his shoes with a 25-bladed pocket-knife. "I should think so," replied the party addressed, with a strong emphasis on the personal pronoun. "Bless my dear eyes," said Mr. Roker, shaking his head slowly from side to side, and gazing abstractedly out of the grated window before him, as if he were fondly recalling some peaceful scene of his early youth. "It seems but yesterday that he whopped the coal-heaver down Fox under the hill by the wharf there. I think I can see him now, coming up the Strand between the two street-keepers, a little sobered by the bruising, with a patch of vinegar and brown paper over his right eyelid, and that 'ere lovely bulldog, as pinned the little boy arterwards, following at his heels. What a rum thing time is, ain't it, Neddy?" The gentleman to whom these observations were addressed, who appeared of a taciturn and thoughtful cast, merely echoed the inquiry, and Mr. Roker, shaking off the poetical and gloomy train of thought into which he had been betrayed, descended to the common business of life, and resumed his pen. "Do you know what the third gentleman is?" inquired Mr. Pickwick, not very much gratified by this description of his future associates. "What is that Simpson, Neddy?" said Mr. Roker, turning to his companion. "What Simpson?" said Neddy. "Why, him in the 27 and the 3rd, that this gentleman's going to be chummed on." "Oh, him," replied Neddy. "He's nothing exactly. He was a horse-chaunter. He's a leg now." "Ah, so I thought," rejoined Mr. Roker, closing the book, and placing the small piece of paper in Mr. Pickwick's hands. "That's the ticket, sir." Very much perplexed by this summary disposition of his person, Mr. Pickwick walked back into the prison, revolving in his mind what he had better do. Convinced, however, that before he took any other steps, it would be advisable to see, and hold personal converse with, the 3 gentlemen with whom it was proposed to quarter him, he made the best of his way to the 3rd flight. After groping about in the gallery for some time, attempting in the dim light to decipher the numbers on the different doors, he at length appealed to a potboy who happened to be pursuing his morning occupation of gleaning for pewter. "Which is 27, my good fellow?" said Mr. Pickwick. "5 doors further on," replied the potboy. "There's the likeness of a man being hung, and smoking a pipe the while, chalked outside the door." Guided by this direction, Mr. Pickwick proceeded slowly along the gallery until he encountered the portrait of a gentleman, above described, upon whose countenance he tapped with the knuckle of his forefinger, gently at first, and then more audibly. After repeating this process several times without effect, he ventured to open the door and peep in. There was only one man in the room, and he was leaning out of window as far as he could without overbalancing himself, endeavoring with great perseverance to spit upon the crown of the hat of a personal friend on the parade below. As neither speaking, coughing, sneezing, knocking, nor any other ordinary mode of attracting attention made this person aware of the presence of a visitor, Mr. Pickwick, after some delay, stepped up to the window and pulled him gently by the coat tail. The individual brought in his head and shoulders with great swiftness, and surveying Mr. Pickwick from head to foot, demanded in a surly tone what the something beginning with a capital H he wanted. "I believe," said Mr. Pickwick, consulting his ticket, "I believe this is 27 1/3. "Well," replied the gentleman. "I have come here in consequence of receiving this bit of paper," rejoined Mr. Pickwick. "Hand it over," said the gentleman. Mr. Pickwick complied. "I think Rocco might have chummed you somewhere else," said Mr. Simpson, for it was the leg, after a very discontented sort of a pause. Mr. Pickwick thought so also, but, under all the circumstances, he considered it a matter of sound policy to be silent. Mr. Simpson mused for a few moments after this, and then, thrusting his head out of the window, gave a shrill whistle and pronounced some word aloud several times. What the word was, Mr. Pickwick could not distinguish, but he rather inferred that it must be some nickname which distinguished Mr. Martin from the fact of a great number of gentlemen on the ground below immediately proceeding to cry, "Butcher!" in imitation of the tone in which that useful class of society are wont diurnally to make their presence known at area railings. Subsequent occurrences confirmed the accuracy of Mr. Pickwick's impression, for, in a few seconds, a gentleman, prematurely broad for his years, clothed in a professional blue jean frock and top boots with circular toes, entered the room nearly out of breath, closely followed by another gentleman in a very shabby black and a sealskin cap. The latter gentleman, who fastened his coat all the way up to his chin by means of a pin and a button alternately, had a very coarse red face, and looked like a drunken chaplain, which, indeed, he was. These two gentlemen, having by turns perused Mr. Pickwick's billet, the one expressed his opinion that it was a rig, and the other his conviction that it was a go. Having recorded their feelings in these very intelligible terms, they looked at Mr. Pickwick and each other in awkward silence. "It's an aggravating thing, just as we got the bed so snug," said the chaplain, looking at 3 dirty mattresses, each rolled up in a blanket, which occupied one corner of the room during the day, and formed a kind of slab on which were placed an old cracked basin, ewer, and soap dish of common yellow earthenware with a blue flower. "Very aggravating." Mr. Martin expressed the same opinion in rather stronger terms. Mr. Simpson, after having let a variety of expletive adjectives loose upon society, without any substantive to accompany them, tucked up his sleeves, and began to wash the greens for dinner. While this was going on, Mr. Pickwick had been eyeing the room, which was filthily dirty, and smelt intolerably close. There was no vestige of either carpet, curtain, or blind. There was not even a closet in it. Unquestionably, there were but a few things to put away, if there had been one, but, however few in number, or small in individual amount, still remnants of loaves and pieces of cheese, and damp towels and scraps of meat, and articles of wearing apparel, and mutilated crockery, and bellows without nozzles, and toasting forks without prongs, do present something of an uncomfortable appearance when they are scattered about the floor of a small apartment, which is the common sitting and sleeping room of 3 idle men. "I suppose this can be managed somehow," said the butcher, after a pretty long silence. "What will you take to go out?" "I beg your pardon?" replied Mr. Pickwick. "What did you say? I hardly understand you." "What will you take to be paid out?" said the butcher. "The regular chummage is 2 and 6pence. Will you take 3 bob?" "And a bender," suggested the clerical gentleman. "Well, I don't mind that. It's only 2pence apiece more," said Mr. Martin. "What do you say now? We'll pay you out for 3 and 6pence a week. Come." "And a gallon of beer down," chimed in Mr. Simpson. "There. And drink it on the spot," said the chaplain. "Now." "I really am so wholly ignorant of the rules of this place," returned Mr. Pickwick, "that I do not yet comprehend you. Can I live anywhere else? I thought I could not." At this inquiry, Mr. Martin looked with a countenance of excessive surprise at his two friends, and then each gentleman pointed with his right thumb over his left shoulder. This action, imperfectly described in words by the very feeble term of over the left, when performed by any number of ladies or gentlemen who are accustomed to act in unison, has a very graceful and airy effect. Its expression is one of light and playful sarcasm. "Can you?" repeated Mr. Martin, with a smile of pity. "Well, if I knew as little of life as that, I'd eat my hat and swallow the buckle," said the clerical gentleman. "So would I," said the sporting one, solemnly. After this introductory preface, the three chums informed Mr. Pickwick in a breath that money was in the fleet, just what money was out of it, that it would instantly procure him almost anything he desired, and that, supposing he had got it, and had no objection to spend it, if he only signified his wish to have a room to himself, he might take possession of one, furnished and fitted to boot, in half an hour's time. With this the party separated, very much to their mutual satisfaction. Mr. Pickwick once more retracing his steps to the lodge, and the three companions adjourning to the coffee-room, there to expend the 5 shillings, which the clerical gentleman had, with admirable prudence and foresight, borrowed of him for the purpose. "I knowed it," said Mr. Roker, with a chuckle, when Mr. Pickwick stated the object with which he had returned. "Didn't I say so, Neddy?" The philosophical owner of the universal penknife growled an affirmative. "I knowed you want a room for yourself, bless you," said Mr. Roker. "Let me see. You'll want some furniture. You'll hire that of me, I suppose. That's the regular thing." "With great pleasure," replied Mr. Pickwick. "There's a capital room up in the coffee-room flight that belongs to a chancery prisoner," said Mr. Roker. "I'll stand you in £1 a week. I suppose you don't mind that?" "Not at all," said Mr. Pickwick. "Just step there with me," said Roker, taking up his hat with great alacrity. "The matter's settled in 5 minutes. Lord, why didn't you say at first you was willing to come down handsome?" The matter was soon arranged, as the turnkey had foretold. The chancery prisoner had been there long enough to have lost friends, fortune, home, and happiness, and to have acquired the right of having a room to himself. As he labored, however, under the slight inconvenience of often wanting a morsel of bread, he eagerly listened to Mr. Pickwick's proposal to rent the apartment, and readily covenanted and agreed to yield him up the sole and undisturbed possession thereof, in consideration of the weekly payment of 20 shillings, from which fund he furthermore contracted to pay out any person or persons that might be chummed upon it. As they struck the bargain, Mr. Pickwick surveyed him with a painful interest. He was a tall, gaunt, cadaverous man, in an old greatcoat and slippers, with sunken cheeks and a restless, eager eye. His lips were bloodless, and his bones sharp and thin. God help him! The iron teeth of confinement and privation had been slowly filing them down for 20 years. "And where will you live meanwhile, sir?" said Mr. Pickwick, as he laid the amount of the first week's rent in advance on the tottering table. The man gathered up the money with a trembling hand, and replied that he didn't know yet. He must go and see where he could move his bed to. "I am afraid, sir," said Mr. Pickwick, laying his hand gently and compassionately on his arm, "I am afraid you will have to live in some noisy, crowded place. Now, pray, consider this room your own when you want quiet, or when any of your friends come to see you." "Friends," interposed the man, in a voice which rattled in his throat. "If I lay dead at the bottom of the deepest mine in the world, tight screwed down and sodded in my coffin, rotting in the dark and filthy ditch that drags its slime along beneath the foundations of this prison, I could not be more forgotten or unheeded than I am here. I am a dead man, dead to society, without the pity they bestow on those whose souls have passed to judgment. Friends to see me? My God! I have sunk from the prime of life into old age in this place, and there is not one to raise his hand above my bed when I lie dead upon it and say, 'It is a blessing he is gone.'" The excitement, which had cast an unwonted light over the man's face while he spoke, subsided as he concluded, and, pressing his withered hands together in a hasty and disordered manner, he shuffled from the room. "Sides rather rusty," said Mr. Roker with a smile. "Ah, they're like the elephants. They feel it now and then, and it makes them wild." Having made this deeply sympathizing remark, Mr. Roker entered upon his arrangements with such expedition that in a short time the room was furnished with a carpet, 6 chairs, a table, a sofa bedstead, a tea kettle, and various small et ceteras on hire, at the very reasonable rate of 27 shillings and sixpence per week. "Now, is there anything more we can do for you?" inquired Mr. Roker, looking round with great satisfaction, and gaily chinking the first week's hire in his closed fist. "Why, yes," said Mr. Pickwick, who had been musing deeply for some time. "Are there any people here who run on errands and so forth?" "Outside, you mean?" inquired Mr. Roker. "Yes, I mean who are able to go outside, not prisoners." "Yes, there is," said Roker. "There's an unfortunate devil who has got a friend on the poor side that's glad to do anything of that sort. He's been running odd jobs and that for the last 2 months. Shall I send him?" "If you please," rejoined Mr. Pickwick. "Stay, no. The poor side, you say? I should like to see it. I'll go to him myself." The poor side of a debtor's prison is, as its name imports, that in which the most miserable and abject class of debtors are confined. A prisoner having declared upon the poor side pays neither rent nor chummage. His fees, upon entering and leaving the jail, are reduced in amount, and he becomes entitled to a share of some small quantities of food, to provide which a few charitable persons have, from time to time, left trifling legacies in their wills. Most of our readers will remember that, until within a very few years past, there was a kind of iron cage in the wall of the Fleet Prison, within which was posted some man of hungry looks, who, from time to time, rattled a money box and exclaimed in a mournful voice, "Pray remember the poor debtors! Pray remember the poor debtors!" The receipts of this box, when there were any, were divided among the poor prisoners, and the men on the poor side relieved each other in this degrading office. Although this custom has been abolished, and the cage is now boarded up, the miserable and destitute condition of these unhappy persons remains the same. We no longer suffer them to appeal at the prison gates to the charity and compassion of the passers-by, but we still leave unblotted in the leaves of our statute book, for the reverence and admiration of succeeding ages, the just and wholesome law which declares that the sturdy felon shall be fed and clothed, and that the penniless debtor shall be left to die of starvation and nakedness. This is no fiction. Not a week passes over our heads, but in every one of our prisons for debt, some of these men must inevitably expire in the slow agonies of want, if they were not relieved by their fellow prisoners. Turning these things in his mind, as he mounted the narrow staircase at the foot of which Roker had left him, Mr. Pickwick gradually worked himself to the boiling over point, and so excited was he with his reflections on this subject, that he had burst into the room to which he had been directed before he had any distinct recollection either of the place in which he was, or the object of his visit. The general aspect of the room recalled him to himself at once, but he had no sooner cast his eyes on the figure of a man who was brooding over the dusty fire than, letting his hat fall on the floor, he stood perfectly fixed and immovable with astonishment. Yes, in tattered garments and without a coat, his common calico shirt yellow and in rags, his hair hanging over his face, his features changed with suffering and pinched with famine, there sat Mr. Alfred Jingle, his head resting upon his hand, his eyes fixed upon the fire, and his whole appearance denoting misery and dejection. Near him, leaning listlessly against the wall, stood a strong-built countryman, flicking with a worn-out hunting whip the top boot that adorned his right foot, his left being thrust into an old slipper. Horses, dogs, and drink had brought him there pell-mell. There was a rusty spur on the solitary boot, which he occasionally jerked into the empty air, at the same time giving the boot a smart blow, and muttering some of the sounds by which a sportsman encourages his horse. He was riding, in imagination, some desperate steeplechase at that moment. Poor wretch! He never rode a match on the swiftest animal in his costly stud, with half the speed at which he had torn along the course that ended in the Fleet. On the opposite side of the room, an old man was seated on a small wooden box, with his eyes riveted on the floor, and his face settled into an expression of the deepest and most hopeless despair. A young girl, his little granddaughter, was hanging about him, endeavoring, with 1,000 childish devices, to engage his attention. But the old man neither saw nor heard her. The voice that had been music to him, and the eyes that had been light, fell coldly on his senses. His limbs were shaking with disease, and the palsy had fastened on his mind. There were 2 or 3 other men in the room, congregated in a little knot, and noisily talking among themselves. There was a lean and haggard woman, too, a prisoner's wife, who was watering, with great solicitude, the wretched stump of a dried-up, withered plant, which, it was plain to see, could never send forth a green leaf again. Too true an emblem, perhaps, of the office she had come there to discharge. Such were the objects which presented themselves to Mr. Pickwick's view as he looked around in amazement. The noise of someone stumbling hastily into the room roused him. Turning his eyes towards the door, they encountered the newcomer, and in him, through all his rags and dirt and misery, he recognized the familiar features of Mr. Job Trotter. "Mr. Pickwick!" exclaimed Job aloud. "Eh?" said Jingle, starting from his seat. "So it is! Queer place! Strange thing! Serves me right! Very!" And with this, Mr. Jingle thrust his hands into the place where his trouser pockets used to be, and, dropping his chin upon his breast, sunk back into his chair. Mr. Pickwick was affected. The 2 men looked so very miserable. The sharp, involuntary glance Jingle had cast at a small piece of raw loin of mutton, which Job had brought in with him, said more of their reduced state than 2 hours' explanation could have done. He looked mildly at Jingle, and said, "I should like to speak to you in private. Will you step out for an instant?" "Certainly," said Jingle, rising hastily. "Can't step far. No danger of overwalking yourself here. Spike Park. Grounds pretty. Romantic, but not extensive. Open for public inspection. Family always in town. Housekeeper desperately careful. Very." "You have forgotten your coat," said Mr. Pickwick, as they walked out to the staircase, and closed the door after them. "Eh?" said Jingle. "Spout. Dear relation. Uncle Tom. Couldn't help it. Must eat, you know. Wants of nature, and all that." "What do you mean?" "Gone, my dear sir. Last coat. Can't help it. Lived on a pair of boots. Whole fortnight. Silk umbrella. Ivory handle. Week. Fact. Honor. Ask Job. He knows it." "Lived for 3 weeks upon a pair of boots and a silk umbrella with an ivory handle?" exclaimed Mr. Pickwick, who had only heard of such things in shipwrecks, or read of them in Constable's Miscellany. "True," said Jingle, nodding his head. "Pawnbroker shop. Duplicate here. Small sums. Mere nothing. All rascals." "Oh," said Mr. Pickwick, much relieved by this explanation. "I understand you. You have pawned your wardrobe." "Everything. Job's too. All shirts gone. Never mind. Saves washing. Nothing soon. Lie in bed. Starve. Die. Inquest. Little bone house. Poor prisoner. Common necessaries. Hush it up. Gentlemen of the jury. Wardsman's tradesman. Keep it snug. Natural death. Coroner's order. Workhouse funeral. Serve 'em right. All over. Drop the curtain." Jingle delivered this singular summary of his prospects in life with his accustomed volubility, and with various twitches of the countenance to counterfeit smiles. Mr. Pickwick easily perceived that his recklessness was assumed, and looking him full but not unkindly in the face, saw that his eyes were moist with tears. "Good fellow," said Jingle, pressing his hand and turning his head away. "Ungrateful dog. Boyish to cry. Can't help it. Bad fever. Weak. Ill. Hungry. Deserved it all, but suffered much. Very." Wholly unable to keep up appearances any longer, and perhaps rendered worse by the effort he had made, the dejected stroller sat down on the stairs and, covering his face with his hand, sobbed like a child. "Come, come," said Mr. Pickwick, with considerable emotion. "We'll see what can be done when I know all about the matter. Here, Job, where's that fellow?" "Yes, sir," replied Job, presenting himself on the staircase. We have described him, by the by, as having deeply sunken eyes in the best of times. In his present state of want and distress, he looked as if those features had gone out of town altogether. "Yes, sir," said Job. "Come here, sir," said Mr. Pickwick, trying to look stern, with 4 large tears running down his waistcoat. "Take that, sir." "Take what?" In the ordinary acceptation of such language, it should have been a blow. As the world runs, it ought to have been a sound, hearty cuff, for Mr. Pickwick had been duped, deceived, and wronged by the destitute outcast who was now wholly in his power. Must we tell the truth? It was something from Mr. Pickwick's waistcoat pocket, which chinked as it was given into Job's hand, and the giving which, somehow or other imparted a sparkle to the eye and a swelling to the heart of our excellent old friend as he hurried away. Sam had returned when Mr. Pickwick reached his own room, and was inspecting the arrangements that had been made for his comfort with a kind of grim satisfaction which was very pleasant to look upon. Having a decided objection to his master's being there at all, Mr. Weller appeared to consider it a high moral duty not to appear too much pleased with anything that was done, said, suggested, or proposed. "Well, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick. "Well, sir," replied Mr. Weller. "Pretty comfortable now, eh, Sam?" "Pretty well, sir," responded Sam, looking round him in a disparaging manner. "Have you seen Mr. Tupman and our other friends?" "Yes, I have seen 'em, sir. And they're a-coming tomorrow, and was really much surprised to hear they weren't to come today," replied Sam. "You have brought the things I wanted?" Mr. Weller, in reply, pointed to various packages, which he had arranged as neatly as he could, in a corner of the room. "Very well, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, after a little hesitation. "Listen to what I am going to say, Sam." "Certainly, sir," rejoined Mr. Weller. "Fire away, sir." "I have felt from the first, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, with much solemnity, "that this is not the place to bring a young man to." "Nor an old un neither, sir," observed Mr. Weller. "You're quite right, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, "but old men may come here through their own heedlessness and unsuspicion, and young men may be brought here by selfishness of those they serve. It is better for those young men, in every point of view, that they should not remain here. Do you understand me, Sam?" "Why, no, sir, I do not," replied Mr. Weller, doggedly. "Try, Sam." "Well, sir," rejoined Sam after a short pause, "I think I see your drift, and if I do see your drift, it's my opinion that you are coming at it a great deal too strong, as the mail coachman said to the snowstorm when it overtook him." "I see you comprehend me, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, "independently of my wish that you should not be idling about a place like this for years to come. I feel that for a debtor in the fleet to be attended by his manservant is a monstrous absurdity." "Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, "for a time you must leave me." "Oh, for a time, eh, sir?" rejoined Mr. Weller, rather sarcastically. "Yes, for the time that I remain here," said Mr. Pickwick. "Your wages I shall continue to pay. Any one of my 3 friends will be happy to take you, were it only out of respect to me. And if I ever do leave this place, Sam," added Mr. Pickwick, with assumed cheerfulness, "if I do, I pledge you my word that you shall return to me instantly." "Now I'll tell you what it is, sir," said Mr. Weller, in a grave and solemn voice. "This here sort of thing won't do at all, so don't let's hear no more about it." "I am serious and resolved, Sam," said Mr. Pickwick. "You are you, sir?" inquired Mr. Weller firmly. "Very good, sir. Then so am I." Thus speaking, Mr. Weller fixed his hat on his head with great precision, and abruptly left the room. "Sam," said Mr. Pickwick, calling after him, "Sam, here." But the long gallery ceased to re-echo the sound of footsteps. Sam Weller was gone.